The low, steady hum of the engine died, swallowed whole by the quiet that waited beyond the winding gravel road. Gavin took a deep breath, exhaling a shiver of unease, mixed with reluctant anticipation. The lake stretched out ahead, glassy and obedient. Under a slowly dimming sky, smeared with soft shades of twilight, purple and peach. Blinked against the sudden chill crawling up his neck and forced himself to step out of the car, fighting the weight lodged in his chest. This was his father's place, now left to him by a hand that no longer held his own. And standing at the edge of the narrow dirt path leading down to the cabin, it felt more like a wilderness of aching memories than a refuge. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, the distant thrum of water lapping against weathered wood, the only other constant. His gaze wandered across the cabin's simple facade. Weather-beaten boards streaked with moss, a sagging roof that had braved a few too many winters, the faded red paint peeling like forgotten promises. Yet beneath the wear and tear was the solidity that had always grounded his father's life. A silent testament to decades spent mending lines, hauling nets, and chasing dawns over these very waters. Gavin's fingers twitched at his sides. What? The faint scar crossing his left cheek tingled. A ghost from an old fishing accident, and a souvenir of the rough-and-tumble relationship he'd shared with his father. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tightening with that familiar swell of loss. Coming back here was harder than he'd imagined. The solitude mattered less than the weight of years pressed into every weathered timber, every whispered wave. But just as he closed the car door behind him, a sudden rustling broke the silence. His heart stuttered, not from fear, but an unexpected flicker of something more complicated. Out of the shadows emerged a tall figure, fishing gear in hand, clothes dusted with pine needles and damp earth. Miles. Gavin blinked, incredulity twisting in his gut. Miles. What the hell are you doing here? Miles shifted the weight of a well-used rod over his shoulder, his sandy blonde hair catching the last glimmers of daylight. His ocean-blue eyes held a hesitant smile, the kind that tried to bridge distance and time with familiarity, but never quite reached it. "Needed to get away," he said simply, voice low, like he was hoping the words would be enough explanation, enough connection. "You know, life." The noise. Thought maybe the lake would drown some of it out. He shrugged. The small tattoo on his right wrist catching the light, a delicate wave curling around an anchor, a symbol faintly ironic in this place of enduring stability. Gavin's body responded with a jolt of warmth, confusion, and something tender, fragile, like a candle struggling against the wind. "Here?" "Alone?" His voice cracked just slightly. Miles gave a small laugh, one that was rough around the edges, as if chipping away at the armor they'd both worn for years. "Not exactly. I figured you might want company. Or someone to make sure you don't disappear into the trees or drown in the lake, figuratively speaking." He paused, searching Gavin's face. "You didn't say no." The words felt heavier than expected, more than a casual offer of friendship. There was a longing there, an unspoken need that made Gavin's heart catch in an unfamiliar way. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, I guess I'm glad you showed up. Kind of needed someone I know." Miles pushed a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that seemed so unlike the confident, brash man Gavin had known for years. "Well, I'm here." For however long you want, they stood side by side on the narrow dirt path leading down to the cabin, the silence settling around them like a tentative truce. The lake mirrored the deepening dusk, a perfect glass reflecting tangled emotions neither of them had words for, yet. For the first time in a long while, Gavin allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Night wrapped around the cabin in thick velvet folds. The sky was an ink-black canvas, punctuated by sparks of distant stars. The lake, a dark mirror that swallowed moonlight and secrets alike. Outside, a fire crackled and popped, stones arranged in a careful circle, casting flickering amber shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Gavin and Miles sat closer than they'd ever been before, separated by nothing but the crackling warmth and an invisible thread woven from years of complicated friendship. The cold night pressed against their backs, but their bodies leaned toward the fire and each other, as if seeking refuge from invisible storms. Gavin broke the silence first, his voice low and rough. "I never thought I'd come back here after Dad died. Feels like walking into a story that's almost over, but I still want to hear the ending." Miles listened, nodding slowly, eyes fixed on the shifting flames. "Yeah, I get that. There are places you don't choose, but they hold you anyway, like some kind of trap dressed up as sanctuary." Gavin glanced at him, taking note of the crease between Miles's brows, the way his jaw tightened just a little. "You don't look like you're running from just the city noise." Miles gave a humorless laugh, tapping ashes from a stick into the fire. "Nope, heartbreak in my case. The kind that makes all the noise inside, louder than any traffic jam." Gavin swallowed past a sudden lump, surprised by the vulnerability unraveling between them. Wasn't ready for this kind of quiet. "Not just out here, but inside," he admitted, his voice dropping to something raw. "Dad's gone, and I'm left with this whole cabin full of ghosts." "Ghosts?" Miles echoed, a soft breath of a word that seemed to carry more weight than sadness alone. "Sometimes I think people keep ghosts because they don't know how to let themselves feel the living pain." There was a pause, weighted with unsaid things, a procession of memories neither dared to voice. But the firelight captured both their faces, carved open, something buried beneath years of bravado and steadfast denial. Gavin's hand twitched toward his knee, resisting a magnetism he couldn't yet name. "You know, I don't think I've ever really seen this side of you," Gavin said quietly, voice almost breaking. "The vulnerable, quiet one, who carries the stuff he won't talk about." Miles looked up then, meeting Gavin's gaze with an honesty that was disarming. "Yeah. Well, you're usually the one who's got all the answers. Or at least pretends like it." His blue eyes shimmered in the firelight, reflecting something fragile. "Guess I'm not as straight as I thought about where I'm supposed to put my pain, either." The confession hung between them, delicate and heavy. Gavin's breath caught. The distance that always seemed to separate them softened, raising years in the span of a shared heartbeat. Neither moved at first, just held their gazes a moment longer, a breath held in the dark. For once the mask slipped, and something real drifted between them unspoken. Twice Gavin's eyes flicked to Miles's lips, as if searching for permission, or permission without words, but none came. Instead, Miles shifted slightly closer, the warmth between their bodies. An electric pulse against the cold night. The fire crackled again, loud and wild. Voices of the past whispered into the night sky. In that quiet, where grief and hope tangled like smoke, they sat talking about broken hearts and lost chances, not quite admitting how much they needed something new to hold on to, something painfully uncertain and terrifyingly close. Gavin's mind raced, but his body softened. Here, on the edge of this old cabin by the lake, he allowed fear and longing to mingle in the cold air, sparking quietly against the dark. Maybe this was a beginning, not just of healing, but something he hadn't dared to hope for. Miles's hand brushed a loose strand of hair back from his face, a small, almost accidental intimacy that lingered too long. Gavin's pulse quickened, the scar on his cheek warming with sudden life, as if the past and the future were clashing silently under the stars. For the first time since he'd arrived, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of possibility. The morning light filtered through the cabin's window, casting soft golden hues across the wooden floorboards and the worn furniture that bore the memories of decades. Outside, the lake lay still, mirror of quiet sky and distant treetop. Gavin stirred beneath the blankets, the remnants of the night's uneasy peace lingering on his skin like a faint pulse. He heard the soft scrape of a chair and then found Miles already dressed, busying himself by the small kitchen counter with an almost reverent care. Gavin's stomach knotted. The early light always brought a sharp reminder of what he'd lost a void, so tangible it felt like it weighed on his chest. Yet there was something about Miles's presence, steady and unassuming, that didn't make the ache seem so lonely. He slipped from the bed, muscles stiff, but his mind oddly alert, despite the previous night's lingering near confession hovering between them. Miles caught his eye and smiled, unforced warm. "Morning," he said softly. "Coffee?" Gavin nodded, stepping over some stray wood shavings near the door and heading outside. The air was crisp, still clinging to the chill of dawn. The cabin sat on a slight rise overlooking the lake, its deck weathered but solid. Miles was already moving toward a small rowboat tied loosely to a nearby post, fishing gear stacked inside. "It's perfect out here," Miles said, reaching down and checking the knots securing the boat. "I forget how quiet this place can be. Not like the city, it's a different kind of noise." Gavin responded with a small smile, his eyes tracing the far horizon where the water met the sky in soft gradients of blue and peach. "It's peaceful," he admitted, almost reluctantly. "If you ignore the silence." Miles caught the hesitation, the way Gavin's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to the thick woods beyond the cabin before settling back on the smooth surface of the lake. "Silence can be a kind of pressure, huh?" Miles said quietly, picking up the fishing rods and sliding the boat's motor cap into place. "Maybe because it gives us room to hear the things we'd rather keep quiet." Gavin's lips pressed into a tighter line. "Or it forces you to remember what you lost," he said, voice low. Miles nodded. "Yeah." Then, after a moment, he added, "But sometimes that kind of remembering can help you move forward. Not forget, kind of remembering. Just," he searched for the words, "make room for something new." Gavin looked away, toward the water's edge, where small waves lapped against reeds and scattered stones. The truth was, it wasn't just about memories. It was about the walls he'd built so carefully, brick by brick, around his heart since his husband's death. No one had really come close since. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let anyone in at all, especially not Miles's best friend, his anchor, in many ways, but also the one person who made him feel both safe and wildly vulnerable. They pushed the boat into the lake, oars slicing through glassy water with gentle, rhythmic ease. Silence stretched between them, not the suffocating silence of Gavin's past, but a different kind, more tentative and expectant. Miles fished with quiet concentration while Gavin focused on the ripples spreading from their rowboat, the occasional flicker of small fish beneath the surface. Minutes passed, marked only by the soft plunk of baited hooks, the gentle slap of oars, and the distant call of birds rising on the morning breeze. It was peaceful enough to think clearly, or at least to attempt it. "So," Miles said, breaking the stillness but without pressing too hard, "why did you ask me here?" "I mean, really?" Gavin's hands clenched slightly around his fishing rod, his eyes narrowing with an unreadable edge. "I didn't exactly ask," he murmured. "You just showed up." Miles smiled, a little sheepishly. "I guess I couldn't stay away." Gavin's gaze flicked to him sharply. "Why?" Miles blinked, caught under the weight of the question. "Because you're my best friend and I think you needed someone, even if you don't think you do." There was something in Miles's words, a simple, honest truth, that struck deeper than Gavin expected. It wasn't just about friendship. There was something vulnerable beneath the surface, a hint of something more complicated that neither man dared to name outright just yet. "I don't know if I'm ready for company," Gavin admitted, voice low and hesitant. "Not really. This place, it's been my refuge. My way of keeping some kind of control." His words faltered, the edges fraying with unspoken pain. "Letting people in. It means risking losing what little peace I have left." Miles nodded, his expression softening like a hand reaching gently toward a fragile flame. "I get that. Trust doesn't come easy, especially after you've lost so much." His tattooed wrist brushed along the edge of the boat, tracing invisible patterns. "But maybe it's not about losing peace. Maybe it's about sharing it." Gavin swallowed, the knot in his throat tightening. "Sharing peace sounds almost poetic for it to be true." Miles laughed, quiet and warm, breaking the heaviness momentarily. "Yeah. Well, I'm better at fishing than poetry." The corner of Gavin's mouth twitched toward a smile. "That's true." For a moment, the tension between them released just enough for the space to feel less lonely, less guarded. Gavin felt the flicker of something unfamiliar, hopeful, tentative, and, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to breathe in it. Later that day, back inside the cabin, the mood shifted into something more fragile, more intimate. Gavin had been moving about, tidying up, trying not to think too hard about the simmering emotions beneath the surface. But Miles lingered near the small bookshelf, his gaze caught on a cluster of framed photographs lining the worn mantelpiece. It didn't take long before Miles reached out with gentle fingertips, lifting a photo out of its frame. Younger Gavin, smiling with a man whose eyes were full of warmth, as if caught forever in a moment of love and happiness. The man in the photo wore a soft blue shirt, his arm draped comfortably around Gavin's shoulders. Miles didn't speak immediately. He sat down on the couch quietly, holding the picture as if it were something sacred. Gavin's heart clenched, the familiar ache rising like tide water, threatening to pull him under. He sat beside Miles, the cabin suddenly feeling smaller, more vulnerable. "That okay?" Miles asked, finally, voice low. "And?" Gavin hesitated, then nodded. "That's him, Daniel." His voice cracked slightly. "My husband. He passed away 5 years ago." Miles's gaze didn't waver. "You miss him?" "Yes." The single word held a whole world of grief and longing. Every day there was a silence, heavy and raw, the kind built of things too painful to say aloud, but too important to ignore. Miles shifted, placing the photo back gently and turning to face Gavin fully. "I want you to know, I can't pretend to understand that kind of loss." His voice thickened. "But I've lost someone too." Gavin looked at him, curiosity prickling beneath the grief. Miles swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tight. "My little sister. She died when I was 23, car accident." End. It was sudden, and it shattered me in ways I didn't know were possible. His eyes darkened with the memory, distant, yet piercing. I spent years shutting people out, walking around like I was hollow, like I had a part of me missing forever. Gavin listened, the walls around his heart quivering in the face of Miles's confession. Here, in his cabin, the friend who he thought he knew so well had revealed a piece of himself he rarely shared. It was a gesture of trust, a bridge across the silence between them. "I didn't know," Gavin whispered, feeling the fragile thread of connection tighten between them. Miles shook his head, a wry, sad smile tugging at his lips. "That's the thing. People don't always see the ways. Grief reshapes us. It's not just about what's lost, but about who we become afterward." Some days I still feel like I'm reaching for a ghost." The room felt smaller again, but this time suffused with a gentle warmth. Gavin reached out, hesitating for only a breath, before his fingers brushed against Miles's wrist. A small touch. A silent thank you for the honesty that had cracked open the space between them. "Maybe," Gavin said slowly, "it's okay if we reach for something real, even when the past feels like a shadow we can't outrun. Maybe that's how we heal." Miles's ocean blue eyes met his deeply, a flicker of something close to hope shining in their depths. "Yay!" He nodded once, firmly. "Maybe it is." The sun shifted behind the clouds outside, casting shifting patterns of light across the wooden floor. In this little cabin, cradled by the lake and forest, two men sat side by side, guarded yet vulnerable, bound by loss and a trembling hope, beginning the slow dance of opening their hearts to what might be. No words were needed to say it. They both knew the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't alone on it. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. Miles shifted slightly in the quiet, the fading light painting faint shadows across his angular features. The air between them still hummed with the sincerity of their earlier exchange, but now an invisible weight settled, heavier, more fragile. Silence stretched just long enough that Gavin began to wonder if he'd crossed a line no one was prepared to talk about. Then, unexpectedly, Miles let out a slow breath, his ocean blue eyes locking onto Gavin's with an intensity that made his chest constrict. "There's something I haven't said. Something I've been trying not to say, because I didn't want to wreck what we have." Gavin's breath caught the faint scar on his cheek, suddenly feeling like a landmark on a terrain that was suddenly unfamiliar. His heart stuttered, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. The pull was magnetic, terrifying, fragile. "I've been lying to myself," Miles admitted, voice low, rough with something raw and unguarded. "I never wanted this, Osto, be just friendship." Not really. His words trembled on the edge of confession, like they might shatter the moment before they fully formed. Gavin's brain stalled. Everything inside him screamed for caution, for retreat, for keeping the walls intact. But his hand, warm against Miles's wrist moments before, still tingled where their skin met. He could feel the gravity in Miles's gaze, the sincerity that burned through the confusion. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Gavin asked, voice hoarse. His pulse thrummed painfully, asking questions his mind couldn't dare answer directly. Miles swallowed hard, jaw tightening. In that way he did when trying to steady himself. "Because I wasn't sure how to. I was scared. Of what it meant for you, for me, for everything." He looked out the window, the last blush of sunset cloaking his profile in softness. "I didn't want to lose you or to mess up the fragile piece you've been trying to hold on to. And maybe selfishly, I wasn't ready to admit what I was feeling because that meant thinking about what I want instead of just being your friend." The weight of confession settled over the room as Gavin felt it all. The fear, the hope, the sharp edge of vulnerability curling up like smoke around his ribs. The idea that Miles might want more than the friendship they'd buried so deeply between laughter and shared history both terrified and electrified him. He didn't pull away, not yet. There was something in honoring Miles' courage, in sitting fully with the discomfort and possibility, that felt like the only thing he could do. "I don't know what to say," Gavin murmured, voice raw and fragile. "I never thought about this. Not like this. But hearing you say it, the way you feel, it makes something inside me jitter, like a nerve I forgot even existed." He swallowed thickly, meeting those blue eyes with a hesitant honesty. "It scares me. But maybe it's time I stop running from that." Miles's lips curved into a small, wild smile, a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Yeah, really?" "For what it's worth," Gavin said, his voice gaining strength even as his heart raced. "I'm not ready to figure it all out. I'm not sure what this means for either of us, but I want to be here with you. Honest, even if it's messy and terrifying." Miles reached out, fingers brushing lightly over the scar, tracing it as if memorizing the map of the man sitting beside him. "Then we figure it out together," he whispered. But as night deepened outside the cabin's windows, and the stars blinked faintly through the gathering dark, Gavin felt a flicker of uncertainty curl inside him, a hesitance born from years of loss and the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The porch was cold when Gavin stepped outside, the chill pressing deep into his bones, but also grounding. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, the fabric rough and familiar, and settled into the worn wooden rocker. The lake was a black mirror, smooth and endless, reflecting the pale moon as it climbed higher. He let out a long breath, the night air sharp and clean. His thoughts spilled over, tangled knots of guilt and shame winding through the hollows of his grief. How could he even entertain the possibility of this? Miles, this man who had been nothing but a steadfast, unshakable friend through the years of loneliness and sorrow. How could he betray the memory of Anna, the life he'd lost, the promises he'd made to himself to remain anchored, to never open that part of himself again? The silence of the wilderness around him was oppressive and comforting all at once. Crickets chirped softly, pine needles whispered in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, water lapped endlessly against the shore. It was a rhythm he'd always known here. A rhythm tied to the past and the fragile present, the slow turning of all the things he'd thought impossible. His gaze drifted upward to the sky, where constellations throbbed with age-old light, distant fires burning relentlessly through the black. A metaphor, maybe, for memory, for passing time, for hope, even when all felt lost. Beside him, the porch creaked under his weight as he rocked slowly back and forth, trying to chase down the spiraling thoughts. I'm supposed to be okay with this. The idea of changing the narrative of his life, allowing someone else to carve into the hard shell he'd built, it was like a crack threatening to open inside him. He wasn't sure if it would bring air or let in the cold. He thought of Miles's words again, the confession barely whispered, but so loud in his mind it played like a relentless tide. I never wanted it to be just friendship. And he felt that too, somewhere deep beneath the carefully guarded layers. Had the comfort of Miles's presence been something more than safety? Guilt twisted around his heart, the memory of Anna flooding into the corners, her laugh, her touch, the life they built and lost, like a fading song. Is this betrayal? The question weighed heavy. A stone sinking fast in a river of doubt. He squeezed his eyes shut and let the tears come, slow and unbidden at first, then gathering strength like rain over parched earth. It was easier outside under the merciful anonymity of night than inside the cabin where every corner held memories, ghosts, and half-forgotten conversations. Somewhere along the way, the ache in his chest stretched and folded into something new, something soft and tentative, hope, desire, or simply the ache of connection waiting to be named. His fingers traced idly along the grain of the wood beneath them, rough and steady and real. He closed his eyes again and let the sounds of the night, water, wind, distant owl, wrap around him, creating a fragile cocoon. The porch had always been his refuge, a place to sit with his grief, to listen for the echo of a life lost and the promise of mornings still to come. Tonight it held something more complicated, the first whisper of possibility, tangled with fear but undeniable. When he finally stood, the muscles in his legs stiff from hours of stillness, the moon hung low and bright, casting silver across the earth. He couldn't say where this would go, or if it would hurt too much, or if the past would always be a shadow between them. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to meet the uncertainty. Gavin stepped back inside, the cabin's warmth embracing him like a hesitant welcome. Miles was sitting quietly, the firelight flickering against his face, eyes wide, with a stillness that mirrored Gavin's own. No words passed between them. None were needed tonight. They were two people on the edge, fragile, trembling, uncertain, but somehow united. And that fragile thread was enough for now. Miles sat there, silence heavy between them, but taut with a kind of tension that neither dared break. He watched Gavin move around the cabin, small, careful tasks that seemed designed to fill the space with something ordinary, something safe. The scrape of a chair pushed in a little too sharply, the faint sigh as Gavin settled back down in the opposite armchair. Every shift in his posture spoke of unspoken thoughts, guarded and raw, as if he were bracing against some invisible pressure. Miles wanted to say something, anything that might ease the weight pressing down on the room. But he also understood, somewhere deep and silent, that Gavin needed time, that the thin veneer of calm was fragile, as delicate as the first skin of ice that covered the lake in late autumn. Too much pressure, too sudden a crack, and everything might shatter. So, he waited, kept his worry locked down, pushing it behind the lines of deliberate quiet he offered. He could see the fight in Gavin's eyes, faint flickers of vulnerability and resistance tangled together, and he knew the grief still lived there, a shadow that clung stubbornly to the edges of every thought, every word left unsaid. His fingers twitched restlessly on his lap, a little tattoo on his wrist suddenly feeling like a chain, a reminder of the barriers he'd always built around himself. Around Gavin, too. How well he'd convinced himself those boundaries were solid, unbreachable. But tonight, they weren't. Not anymore. When? Gavin's voice broke the hush, rough with disuse, far softer than Miles expected. Sorry. Miles blinked, turning his attention fully to him. Gavin swallowed, eyes tracing some distant memory, flickering just beyond the firelight. When did you start seeing me differently, not just as your friend? That question spun the room into a quiet cyclone of emotion. It hung between them, delicate and dangerous, like glass catching the moonlight, just right, beautiful but sharp enough to cut deep. Miles picked at a loose thread on the arm of his sweater, heart hammering against his ribs. He searched for the right words, but somehow they felt both too small and too big at once, incapable of capturing the messy, tangled truth. I don't know if I ever knew exactly when, he said finally, voice low and clipped with some half-formed disbelief. Maybe it was always there, underneath everything else. But I didn't want to see it because you were him. You were the past, Gavin. You were something I thought I had to keep at arm's length. Gavin's breath hitched slightly, a fragile tremor in his chest, revealing how close this came to the nerve he'd tried to hide. He leaned forward, jaw clenched tight, fingers clenched too. But now? Miles swallowed, feeling the suspended moment collapse inward. Now I don't know how to push it away. And I don't want to. He looked at Gavin, searching those deep hazel eyes for permission. Or, perhaps, forgiveness. I don't want to lose you again. Not like this. There was a rawness in that admission, a stark honesty that made the room feel suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer, listening. Gavin blinked the faint scar along his cheek, catching the light like a wounded beacon. The tension in his frame unraveled just a fraction, a small, brittle hope flickering amid the ruins of old grief. "You're not losing me," he whispered, voice trembling but resolute. "Not unless I say so." For the first time that evening, a thin thread of light wove between them, fragile, tentative, but real. It hummed quietly, fragile as a spider's web, but strong enough to hold their combined weight. Hope, maybe, desire, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of something human and aching and unavoidable. Miles reached out tentatively, hand hovering for a moment before settling lightly over Gavin's. Warmth of his skin seeped through, a silent, steady pledge. Neither man pulled away. "Thank you," Gavin said after a breath, voice barely more than a croak, "for staying. For not running." Miles squeezed gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Neither needed to say more. The wordless promise hung in the air, solid and surprising, warming the cold edges of the night. Later, as the fire dwindled to soft embers, they shifted closer. The silence now laced with a different kind of energy, one that trembled but didn't break, that invited and feared intimacy in equal measure. Cabin, with its wooden beams and the faint scent of pine and lake water, felt transformed. It was no longer just a refuge from the outside world. It was becoming a sanctuary, a fragile cocoon, where they might dare to unravel their fears and stitch together new stories. "What scares you most?" Miles asked quietly, voice rough but gentle. Gavin was still staring at the fire, its orange flicker dancing across his features. "That I'll break again. That I'll open this up, and the pain will flood back worse than before." Miles nodded. "I know that feeling." He traced the grain of the coffee table absent-mindedly. "But maybe the real risk is in not opening at all. In staying closed off, holding on to the ghosts until they smother you." "That's what I'm afraid of," Gavin admitted. "That by trying to protect myself, I'm just building higher walls. And everyone ends up on the outside." Miles shifted, meeting Gavin's gaze fully, the weight of his blue eyes steady and sure. "Maybe it's not about walls," he said slowly. "Maybe it's about windows, zones you can open when you're ready. Ones that don't let the storms in, but let the light through, too." Gavin's lips curved in a faint, almost surprised smile. "That sounds like hope." Miles smiled back, a little crooked and unpolished. "Hope sounds a lot better than fear, doesn't it?" For the first time in a long time, Gavin allowed himself to nod. They talked then slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing courage, about what it meant to risk their hearts again. About the fragile balance between holding on and letting go. About the ways love could hurt and heal, sometimes all at once. "I never thought I'd find this again," Gavin confessed, voice raw in the quiet. "Not here, not with you." Miles reached out, brushing a stray lock of dark hair back from Gavin's forehead. "Neither did I. But maybe that's what makes it worth it." They spoke about the past, the pain, the memories, the longing, but also about the future, tentative and undefined. The cabin held their stories, now each rough-hewn plank a witness to their slow rebuilding. Outside, the stars traced a quiet map across the sky. Inside, warmth bloomed, spreading from the fire to their words, their touch, their shared silences. Miles felt a stirring deep inside him. Fragile hope, yes, but also something steadier. The promise of healing, of connection, that didn't deny the shadows, but embraced the light alongside them. Gavin met his eyes again, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. "I don't know where this goes," Gavin said softly, "but I want to find out." "Bye." "With you?" Miles's answer was in his smile, in the warmth of his hand still resting on Gavin's. It was a beginning, tentative, messy, beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, the cabin wasn't just a refuge from loss. It was a home for something new, something fragile and fierce, something worth fighting for. They settled into that quiet understanding, the weight of grief still there, but no longer a barrier. Just part of a larger, unfolding story, one they would write together, day by day, breath by breath. The night deepened around them, but inside, a fragile thread of hope wove stronger and stronger, binding two hearts reluctant but brave enough to beat in tandem against the silence. The morning sun slipped slowly over the edge of the pine trees, golden light spilling through the cabin window in soft, sprawling tendrils that warmed the worn wooden floorboards. The air smelled sharply of pine resin and damp earth, tinged with the faint saltiness seeping in from the nearby lake. Outside, the last cool breath of dawn kissed the surface of the water, turning it briefly into liquid glass before the breeze stirred it into gentle waves. Gavin stood on the weathered dock, hands shoved into the pockets of his faded jeans, watching. The boat, his father's old rowboat, which had been sitting on the shore for far too long, sank quietly under a coat of peeling white paint and mossy patches. It looked tired, forgotten, in the same way he sometimes felt inside. Yet the boat held memories too, echoes of laughter, and quiet afternoons spent gliding over the lake's mirror. The ripple of water a constant companion. Miles appeared behind him, shoulders broad in a hoodie that looked like it had seen better days, boots thudding softly against the wooden planks. "You know," he said, voice light but steady. "I figure if it's to be our, boat, shouldn't she float first?" Gavin turned, his hazel eyes alight with something close to amusement. "You want to fix it?" The question was more surprise than suspicion. Miles nodded, that familiar mischievous sparkle flickering in his ocean blue eyes. "I know my way around a toolbox. Plus, it'll be good to do something with our hands. Work together on something that makes sense to both of us." It wasn't just about the boat. Neither of them said it outright, but the notion of building something tangible, something that could carry them both forward, weighed heavy and hopeful between them. They set to it with shaky hands at first. Miles fetching old sandpaper and tubs of wood filler, Gavin rolling out tarps and hunting down forgotten brushes from the cabin's crowded shed. The scent of fresh paint mingled with the dusty, musty odor of forgotten wood and rusted metal. Outside, birds called to one another, as if cheering their endeavor on. Hands bent over the worn hull, smoothing rough patches and scrubbing away years of neglect. The physical effort gave Gavin a new grounding. Each scrape of the sandpaper was a release, each dab of wood filler a promise of renewal. Miles worked beside him, his movements sure and steady, though his brow furrowed in concentration. They spoke little at first, their conversations punctuated by shared grunts of effort and the occasional soft chuckle. There was a rhythm to the work, like a slow dance choreographed in sweat and calluses, and it drew them closer without push or pull. "Your dad would be proud," Miles said quietly, wiping a trickle of sweat from his forehead. "This whole place, he built more than a cabin and a boat. He built something that lasts. We just have to remember to take care of it." Gavin swallowed hard, the lump rising in his throat, catching on the edges of those words. "I'm scared," he admitted, the sound rough, "that I'll mess it all up. That I'm messing it up already." Miles looked at him, then really looked, like seeing beneath the surface for the first time in days. "You're not alone in this," he said, voice gentle but firm. "We're both figuring it out. Just like this boat." He tapped a spot where the wood filler hadn't quite settled. "It's not perfect yet, but it's getting there. Same for us." The sun climbed higher, sweat matting their hair to their foreheads, but they barely noticed. Their hands grazed now and again, a brush slipping under Gavin's fingers, a glove resting a moment too long on a shoulder. The work became less about the boat and more about them. In those moments of accidental contact, the unspoken acknowledgments passed between calloused palms and tentative gazes. When the last coat of paint was drying and the sun beat down hot on their backs, they finally stood back to appraise their labor. The boat gleamed imperfect but proud, ready to carry them out onto the water. Miles clapped Gavin on the shoulder, his smile wide and warm. Tomorrow, we take her out. Gavin's heart lifted on the quiet certainty of that promise. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That night, the cabin was filled with the soft glow of the small lantern perched on the table. The aroma of toasted bread mingled with the scent of garlic simmering in a pan. They sat side by side, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in front of them, the remnants of a simple dinner spread between them, grilled trout from the lake, fresh herbs, a salad plucked from Gavin's small but thriving garden. The conversation drifted like smoke, light and easy, settling into the comfortable spaces left between them. Miles reached for a slice of bread, tearing it gently, eyes flicking up to meet Gavin's. There was something watching in those blue depths, a quiet urgency wrapped in familiar ease. "I've been meaning to say something," Miles began, voice catching slightly in the warm hush of the evening. "It's been strange coming here. Not strange in a bad way, but strange because of me." Gavin tilted his head, waiting without interrupting, curious in that careful way that opened doors without pushing. Miles sighed a breath that seemed to settle years of tension in his chest. "You know, I've always said I'm straight, always. It's been like a badge or a label, something fixed and certain. It helped me make sense of who I was, the choices I made." He paused. The flickering lantern seemed suddenly too bright, the quiet too sharp. "But sitting here with you, being here with this place, with everything I'm feeling, it doesn't feel like that anymore. It's like the word straight stops making sense. Like maybe I've been narrowing myself into something that isn't all of me. That part of me is shifting." Gavin swallowed, warmth pooling low in his chest. "You're saying you don't feel so straight anymore?" Miles laughed softly, a sound raw with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I'm saying I don't know what I feel anymore, but I know it feels real. And it scares the hell out of me. Because being honest about that means admitting all the parts of myself I've been hiding even from me." Gavin reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Miles's wrist, tracing over the small tattoo there, a delicate anchor that seemed to hold more meaning than he realized. "It takes real courage," he whispered, "to face yourself like that. To say it out loud to someone you trust." Miles's smile faltered into something softer, a look of gratitude and something like awe. "I've never had to be that honest before, not with anyone. It's terrifying. But here, with you, I want to try." They laughed then, quietly, shared and unburdening, laughing at the unexpected twists life threw at them, at the awkwardness of uncharted territory, at the sheer ridiculousness of 2 men sitting in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, discovering pieces of themselves they'd lost or never known. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickers of light to dance across their faces, shadows chasing around the high beams of the ceiling. Outside, the night was deep and calm, cradling the world in a velvet cloak. Gavin's eyes found Miles's again, steady and certain, despite the vulnerability laced through every word. "We'll figure it out," he said, voice low and unwavering. "Whatever this is, together." Miles's breath hitched, the simple certainty grounding the wildness inside him. "Together?" he echoed, and in the quiet moments that followed, filled only with the sound of their breathing and the soft rustle of the wind beyond the window, they discovered something neither had dared hope for. A trust that could hold all the fractured pieces of their hearts, woven tightly enough to carry them through whatever came next. The cabin was no longer just a refuge or a memory. It was a beginning, and they were ready. The wind had picked up long before either of them noticed. The sky outside, which had been a steady quilt of stars moments ago, frayed into something wild, dark, thick clouds, piling higher and higher like a brewing tempest, deciding on its vengeance. It started as a distant rumble, the sort of low, rolling growl that sets your teeth on edge, the kind you feel in your gut before it even breaks the silence. Then, without warning, the rain hammered against the roof in furious sheets, each drop drumming a frantic rhythm that filled the tight spaces of the cabin with urgency. They had planned to hike the ridge trail in the morning, talk more about everything and nothing, breath crisp as the sun rose behind the swelling hills. But now, trapped within these wooden walls, the evening stretched long and uncertain, as if the storm outside had taken possession of their time and tethered them here, forced into close quarters where pretense and distance could no longer shelter the truth between them. Gavin sat near the hearth, fingers absently tracing the rim of his mug, while his eyes kept flickering to the window pane streaked with rain. A corner of his mind whispered of the freedom that awaited outside, the wild forests, the clean air, but the cabin felt like a cocoon, its warmth seeping into his bones, despite the growing tempest. He could hear the wind threading through the cracks in the old timbers, howling like some restless spirit trying to claw its way inside. The sound unsettled him, raw and untamed, but didn't compare to the storm swirling beneath his ribs. Miles was curled on the opposite edge of the couch, knees drawn to his chest beneath a well-worn blanket he'd pulled from the back of the cupboard. His gaze stayed fixed on the rapidly darkening room, as if following some invisible thread in the space between them. His fingers tapped a slow, uncertain cadence on his knee, a nervous rhythm that spoke volumes of the restless energy cracking beneath his calm facade. He hadn't said much since the storm had swallowed the night, but it didn't feel like silence born from awkwardness. Instead, it was thick with possibility, heavy with the weight of things unspoken. The first lightning split the sky apart, a stark white fissure illuminating the cabin's timber frame for a breathless instant. Thunder immediately followed, crashing so close it felt as if the sky might shatter into splinters and rain down upon the earth. Miles flinched, the suddenness of the explosion jarring him out of his thoughts. Gavin watched, saw the tension knotting in Miles's shoulders, the way his breath hitched just beneath the noise. He knew that kind of reaction had lived in its shadow for years. It was a momentary unraveling, a crack in the worn mask, a vulnerability that felt sacred. Without thinking, Gavin reached out, fingers brushing against Miles's knee before trailing slowly up his thigh. The contact was timid, unremarkable, in the harsh fluorescent lights of a bar or crowded street. But here it was, everything. The storm outside roared as if in warning, but inside, the cabin stilled around that fragile touch. They both sensed how monumental it was, how deep a chasm it bridged, and Miles turned just enough for their hands to finally meet, fingers weaving together with a tentative certainty that said more than words ever could. Gavin's throat tightened, a jolt of warmth blooming beneath his skin where their hands tangled. It was an odd sensation, electric and grounding all at once, like finding a lighthouse in a storm long expected but never imagined. He swallowed, voice rough, when he finally spoke. "I'm glad you're here," he said, each syllable a whispered truth carried on the wind's relentless howl. 6 Miles didn't answer right away, but his grip tightened imperceptibly, filled with something fierce and fragile that seized Gavin's heart in spite of himself. Then, as lightning flickered again and the world outside seemed to shatter around them, Miles's voice broke through the tempest's song, low and raw. "I'm scared, Gavin. Scared I'll lose you before we even get this started. That I'll hold on too tightly, because I don't know how to be with you without everything falling apart." The words were slow, deliberate, and somehow immense in their vulnerability. Gavin's breath caught. He recognized that fear, the shadow it cast over every new beginning. Loss hung between them, like a ghost, a fragile line drawn in the dirt. But Miles had spoken it aloud now, held it out, steady and true. "I know," Gavin whispered, voice trembling just enough to break the quiet. The fat knot of grief that had lodged deep inside him since his husband died stirred painfully, pulling at old scars he barely dared touch. I'm afraid too. Afraid moving forward means betraying him. His fingers tightened around Miles's hand, that small act a bridge across generations of pain and love. That if I build something new here, I'm tearing down everything that I promised to keep sacred. Miles's pulse fluttered in response, his eyes searching Gavin's. Desperate for something solid in the shifting sands of their fears. But what if it's not betrayal? What if loving you doesn't mean forgetting him? Maybe we don't have to choose between the two. Maybe he'd want me to be the one who holds you when the nights are empty. The honesty in Miles's voice was a salve, the kind that eased the ache but didn't erase the wounds. Gavin let out a shaky breath, the tension in his chest loosening bit by bit as warmth pooled in the space between their entwined fingers. In the storm's shadow, where thunder rolled like ancient drums and rain hammered its relentless chorus onto the roof, something fragile and profound took root. "How did you get so brave?" Gavin joked, voice cracking with a tear he didn't bother to hide. Miles gave a half-smile, a flicker of mischief spotted with genuine warmth. "Maybe because I've been waiting for something worth risking. And maybe because you needed me to." Their laughter mingled, soft and shaky in the firelight, weaving through the sound of the storm, stitching together the fragile threads of hope and fear. The thunder's fury outside was no match for the quiet courage that filled the cabin. That fragile defiance of uncertainty and pain. They sat closer, now knees touching beneath the blanket, hands still tangled, breathing, shared and steady. Miles tilted his head toward Gavin, mouth hovering just a breath away from his ear. "I don't want to lose you, not just as a friend. Not now." Gavin's heart hammered, a wild song of yearning and relief. "You won't, I promise. We'll take it. Slow no promises beyond today. But I want to try, Miles. I want to see where this goes, even if we don't have all the answers." A tremor ran through Miles's shoulders as he exhaled. "I think that's all we can ask for." "Eh?" "No guarantees." Gavin pressed his forehead against Miles's temple, the heat of his breath mingling with the cooling storm air drifting in the cabin's slight cracks. "Together," he repeated, voice steady with conviction. "Together," Miles echoed back. Outside, the wind howled and the rain struck the windows. But inside the cabin, held in the raw cocoon of their shared vulnerability, world softened. No need for pretense, no need for masks. Just two broken, brave hearts reaching for a future neither had dared imagine, yet both, desperately, hoped to hold. The storm loomed wild and unpredictable, as the feelings churning between them, but for now, here in the quiet sanctuary of light and warmth, they had found something steadier, something that might just carry them through the darkest nights. When dawn finally broke, it did so gently, a shy, tentative light slipping through the windows, casting a soft glow over the worn wooden floor and the tangled blanket beneath which two silhouettes still lingered close. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean, quiet, but for the drip of water from the eaves and the distant caw of restless ravens circling the lake's edge. Outside, the early morning mist shimmered like gauzy veils, softening the ragged pine trees and smoothing the harsh angles of the landscape, as if offering the earth a chance to breathe free and new again. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted, subtle but palpable, as if the night storm had cleared not only the sky, but also something heavier, older, lodged intimately in their chests. Gavin felt it acutely, a fresh openness pooling behind his ribs where grief and longing had once tangled in a grim knot. He turned his face toward Miles, who was still asleep, the lines around his mouth softened, his golden eyelashes resting lightly against his cheekbones. In this fragile calm, Gavin's thoughts came unbidden, threading the past and future together, like old trusted fishing nets mended with new fibers. The memory of his husband, warm and vivid, lingered like sunlight on water, but now it shared the space with Miles's steady presence. A new current rising alongside the old. The future wasn't an ominous void anymore. It shimmered with possibility, quiet but insistent. They had found something in the storm, truth maybe, or the courage to admit a hope neither had dared name aloud until yesterday evening. Gavin reached out slowly, brushing back a stray lock of sandy blonde hair from Miles's forehead. He felt the heat of their skin just beyond the thin wool blanket, steady and reassuring. Miles's eyes fluttered open, meeting his with that flicker of something more than friendship, a dawning promise that neither spoke but both understood. "Morning," Miles whispered, voice thick with sleep and warmth. "Morning," Gavin replied softly. He hesitated a moment, then his fingers closed lightly over Miles's. "You stayed." Miles gave a small, tired smile that made Gavin's chest ache with tenderness. "Yeah, I couldn't leave last night." "Not when?" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't come easily. "Not when it felt like we found something." They stayed like that for a long minute, hands clasped, breathing synchronized, letting the silence between their words speak louder than the past's heavy weight. When Miles finally spoke again, it was with a quiet certainty. "I never thought I'd say this. I want to see what us could be. I want to try." Gavin's pulse caught in his throat, a swell of relief and something fierce and tender. "Me too." He lingered on the promise, the simple truth, feeling it in every inch of his skin. The air brightened steadily as hours passed. Outside, the world shook off the storm's residue. Fallen leaves scattered beneath the pines, the lake's surface catching the sun in trembling flashes, bluebirds darting through the crisp morning air. Inside, the space between them felt lighter, less haunted by unspoken fears. Moving forward didn't mean erasing the past, but honoring it, holding it gently, even as they opened their hearts to something new. Later that morning, after a fire had been coaxed back to life and coffee steeped, dark and rich between them, Gavin hesitated before speaking again. "There's something I want to show you," he said, voice low. Miles blinked, curious. "What's that?" Gavin reached beneath the bed, fingers trailing over the cool wooden floor before lifting a battered, leather-bound journal with care. It was worn at the edges, the leather soft and cracked, an intimate relic from a life once shared. "It belonged to my husband," his voice caught briefly. "I don't usually look at it anymore. Not since. But last night, after we talked, I found myself flipping through it again." Miles shifted closer, the old creak of the floorboards quiet beneath their feet. "Can I?" Gavin nodded and opened the journal on his lap, thumbs tracing the faint inked handwriting that spilled across the yellowed pages. There were notes about fishing spots, weather patterns, but also more personal things, dates marked with little hearts, entries about hopes, regrets, and quiet dreams. One passage in particular caught Gavin's eye and fingered heavily. The words, penned with a slant that seemed hurried yet deliberate, read like a benediction. Asterisk. "If you ever find happiness again, in whatever form, let it in. Don't be afraid of new love, Gavin. You deserve joy beyond our years together." The ache in Gavin's chest softened, a slow exhale of forgiveness and grace. He looked up, meeting Miles's gaze, the young man's expression unreadable but attentive, open. "I never shared this before," Gavin admitted. "It's like he wanted me to know it was okay, to be happy again, to find a life that isn't shadows." Miles swallowed, nodding slowly. "That's beautiful, and he loved you enough to want that for you. That's real love." "Yeah." Gavin let the journal close gently. "It feels like permission. Like the last piece of a puzzle I didn't realize was missing. It eases the final barrier. to wanting. This, he gestured between them, voice trembling only slightly. To love again, without guilt or fear. Miles's hand found his, squeezing firmly, grounding them in the moment. Thank you for trusting me with that. I'll hold it carefully, just like I will you. They remained nestled in the worn armchair, sunlight sliding across the faded plaid fabric, the silence heavy with shared histories and fresh beginnings. Later that evening, beneath a sky washed clean and glittering with stars, Gavin and Miles sat side by side, the cabin bathed in golden lamplight and the smoky scent of pine logs burning low. The hours stretched, lazy and lush, as they talked, not with the measured caution of old friends, but with unveiled honesty and fragile hope. There were no masks left to wear, no shadows to hide behind. They spoke of everything, fears that hadn't dared surface before, moments of unexpected joy, memories of loss, and the hunger for healing. I never thought I'd get this close, Miles confessed, voice warm but unguarded, or that I could feel something so complicated, so real with you. Gavin smiled, heart swelling with something fierce and tender all at once. Neither did I, but it's the best kind of complicated. Miles laughed softly, a sound that seemed to brighten even the deepest corners of the cabin. You're terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. And you, Gavin teased gently, stubborn enough to make me believe in new beginnings. They talked on like that, words and silences blending seamlessly. Until the night gave way to pale blue fingers of dawn, when the first bird called in the distance, they were still there, shoulders touching, feet tangled, bodies a quiet testament to the fragile, delicious work of building something new. Morning came with a bittersweet light. Miles moved slowly, gathering his few belongings with the care of someone reluctant to uproot. The weight of goodbye pressed gently but insistently against the comfort of their shared days. Gavin watched him, the cabin feeling suddenly quieter, more hollow, as if breathing itself was held for a moment longer. Miles zipped his bag with a slow finality, then turned to face Gavin, his eyes unreadable for a heartbeat before a soft laugh escaped. I can't stay away, he said quietly, the words a promise ringing clear in the morning air. Gavin's lips curled into a smile that reached his eyes, a warmth blooming inside that was unmistakably bright. Good, he whispered, because I don't want you to. Miles took a step forward, closing the space between them with a slow certainty. This, what we're starting, it feels fierce. Honest. Like nothing I've ever dared to hope for. It's real, Gavin said, voice steady and sure, and it's ours, wherever it goes. As the first sun poured gold through the windows, they stood together, hands clasped, the future sprawling out before them, not as a frightening expanse, but as a horizon lit by hope, acceptance, and the fierce beauty of shared hearts brave enough to embrace the unknown. Outside, the lake mirrored the morning sky, clear, steady, endless. Inside, the cabin held two men who, against the odds and storms, had found a sanctuary not just of wood and fire, but of courage, truth, and a love that whispered of tomorrows, unbroken and new.